This is the Tree of Life, Season 17, Chapter 3. In this episode, we will be talking about tension created by a self-conscious deficit of digital structures relative to some self-conscious subject. To start out, in the last episode, we talked about how when there is an abundance of digital structures relative to some self-conscious subject, it produces an accumulation of self-consciousness relative to some self-conscious subject. In the negation of a bodily rhythm, when the attention is fixed on some rhythm, it results in the conversion of these digital structures to analog or substitutionary ones. In past episodes, we talked about how when there is a flipping of phase with respect to some arrangement of dialectical impulses, it represents a release. But this release is a quantized manifestation of tension. On the larger scale, when self-consciousness accumulates within digital structures relative to some self-conscious subject, the tension builds unless there is a phase flip relative to those dialectical impulses. In the negation of an impulse, when the attention is fixed self-consciously on some bodily rhythm, representing negation, it elongates the phase corresponding to the linked digital structures, which is why they must be converted to analog structures through the negation. The accumulation of self-consciousness within a particular arrangement of a set of digital structures thus represents a larger accumulation of tension, which in conversion to an analog structure, which is substitutionary for the negated rhythm, finds a release. In other words, practically, what we see is that the negation corresponding to a particular rhythm prevents a phase flip within digital structures corresponding to some self-conscious subject. This forces the phase flip to occur within the converted analog structure, through the substitution of some impulse for the release of the bodily rhythm itself. In other words, what we see is that the conversion of digital to analog structures occurs, because the negation and sublimation prevents a phase flip within those digital structures, forcing a conversion to an analog structure substitutionary to the impulse to release that rhythm. During the period prior to when the digital structures flips phase, and before the flipping of the analog structure obtaining a release to that rhythm, there is an analog structure, which is substitutionary as between the impulse 1, the alternate phase of the digital structure, which was obviated by the failure to flip phase, by impulse 2, the impulse to release a bodily rhythm. This is the transitionary structure between the digital and analog variants. Note, this means that impulse 1 is negational in both analog and digital variants. Further, what we know is that when the digital structures can't flip phase prior to the conversion, it limits the conformational arrangements open to that structure and any linked structures. In other words, the negation and sublimation, which coincides with the extension of the phase within the digital variant, displaces the phase flip onto a bodily cycle or rhythm within an analog structure. Thus, we can see how this sublimation generates expression of a bodily rhythm in finding a release. During the period prior to the release of the tension built up through the deficit created by self-consciousness, we see a resonant cavity created within the bodily rhythm. This resonant cavity is created by the linking of a series of structure members to a particular phase interlinked with analog variants. These analog variants produce a dialogue through context exclusion. That's the end of the podcast for today.